Hi everyone, and thank you very much, firstly to Kerry for inviting me in the first place and for setting up quite a high expectation about how fun and exciting this is going to be. I'll try and live up to that. Um, and thank you also to Barbara and her team for organising this. As someone who's new to this forum, I really appreciate all the work that's gone into it. Um, so I should say at the outset that you might notice that I have actually dropped the CCS from my title sneakily, and that's a reflection of the fact that after speaking to Kerry, she invited me to sort of approach this from a bit of a slant, which is something I always respond to positively as a social scientist. So I'm going to be talking a little bit more about other net zero technologies because I think we can learn from them, and my intention overall and with that is to really, like Barbara said, to sort of spark the lively engagements and discussions. So really, I'd like to the main thing I'd like to get out of this today is really to just spark some more conversations. Um, so Kerry mentioned a little bit about my background and where I'm sort of coming from. So I come from an academic background, and that may be apparent in some of the slides. I'll try not to be too boring and theoretical, and apply what I'm talking about. And my expertise is really in qualitative research, so speaking with people and understanding their points of view. And looking particularly at public perceptions of technologies with a particular interest in environmental issues, but also other technologies that are quite different from what we're going to be talking about today, like biotechnologies. So I'm very interested in bioethical questions, and I became principal social scientist at the Environment Agency, as mentioned, a couple of years ago, and I lead the team's work on net zero. So the Environment Agency, for those who don't know, is the kind of primary arm's length body in England. So we don't cover the whole of the UK. There are other bodies that do similar work in the devolved nations, which is charged with the responsibility of sort of protecting the environment. And we have three kind of main functions within that. So there's the operational work, such as things like maintaining flood defences and that sort of thing. There's policy work, so advice to government, and then there's the regulatory work that we do. And as I say, I lead the team's work on net zero. And so within the Environment Agency, we have a chief scientist and a chief scientist group of scientists. And within that, there is a research programme on net zero. And I work very closely with colleagues in the chief scientist group who are particularly looking at the environmental impacts of different aspects of net zero. And then I'm looking at the sort of social impacts, but also because we're not necessarily quite there yet, knowing what the impacts will be, public perceptions, which sort of get us on the road to that. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of some of the work that we've been doing. So this is a recently published report on environmental and social implications of energy storage technologies, which I worked on when I first joined the Environment Agency. And then it's going to come out soon, hopefully, is a report that I've been working on myself. And this is kind of the main project I've been working on, which is a review of the evidence, as well as some original research around a few case study technologies. So lithium batteries, heat networks, and ocean alkalinity enhancement. And so that's quite a broad range of technologies which are intended to represent different aspects of how people, behaviour change, and public engagement kind of come into the net zero story, but also that touch on the different aspects of the Environment Agency's regulatory role. And a lot of that evidence is what I'm going to be sort of drawing on for illustrations today. So I'll start with my sort of pitch for social science. I think that these are kind of the main things that social science can bring to net zero, and it can be applied more broadly. I think empirical research is really, really important. A lot of net zero policy is based in modelling, which is also extremely important. But I think that's one of the reasons why we get these gaps of, but why do people think like this? Why are they reacting in this way that we didn't anticipate? So, which sort of leads on to the second one, which is, I think, about demystifying public perceptions and reactions. More broadly, it can offer conceptual models and tools to understand social change. And I'm going to be talking a lot about change today, because I think that's in many ways a sort of somewhat overlooked aspect of net zero. And then it can also be applied. We can use the insights from social science research to help drive behavioural interventions, because we know behaviour change is really important in net zero, policy levers, and to inform public conversations and stakeholder engagement. And I know some of you are social scientists, so this will be a bit Coles to Newcastle, but some of the sort of key themes that come up in the research, and I couldn't possibly cover them all today, and I'm not going to try to, so don't worry, are these ones that I've listed here. I'm going to focus quite in a fairly limited way, but in a broad way at the same time. Hopefully you'll understand what I mean by that by the end of this. So I'm going to talk, like I mentioned, a lot about change and what change means to people. I'm going to talk about the importance of place, and I'm going to talk a little bit about public engagement, but hopefully I'll also be, in a sense, indicating what I think about public engagement sort of through what I say. So in the UK, the Climate Change Act commits the government by law to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 100% of 1990 levels on net zero by 2050. So we know what we have to do, but how do we do it? Many people, including policymakers, tend to refer to net zero as a socio-technical challenge. So I'm here to sort of ask, what is the socio in socio-technical? So it's about how people or the public think about net zero and the societal, technological, economic and behavioural changes that go along with it. And I should say at the outset that focusing on the socio doesn't necessarily mean neglecting the technical. In fact, I'd really like to emphasise that this is a challenge and a transition that's all about those kind of sticky bits in between society and technology. And we always need to be thinking about both and how they interact with each other. Because as you know, technologies need users, and users of technologies need compelling reasons to adopt a new technology or to switch from one version to another. We also know that technologies and the changes that they entail need to be effective, safe, salient, and affordable. So a socio-technical challenge is one of both technology and society, and we need people working on this together from every and all disciplines, which is why it's great to be here today. The term socio-technical also features in social scientific theory in the concept of socio-technical imaginaries, which has been pioneered by Sheila Jasanoff and Sang-Hyun Kim. So back in 2009, they defined imaginaries as collectively imagined forms of social life and social order reflected in the design and fulfillment of nation-specific scientific and technological projects. And since then, they've gone on to refine this further, arguing that they're also powerful cultural resources that help shape social responses to innovation. So in other words, they're saying that shared visions of the future, which reflect what social life is and should be, shape the design, implementation and governance of science and technology. And as the last quote on the slide says, socio-technical imaginaries are more than ideas. They bring material projects into being, justify them, and thereby open up or close down competing options for how to govern transformations to sustainability. So these collective visions of the future are not just ideas that exist in the abstract, but they have material effects. They help determine what seems possible and what doesn't. And one of the ways that they do this is by perpetuating norms and establishing new ones. So Jasanoff and Kim tend to focus on the socio-technical imaginaries of whole countries or national governments. More recent work in this area has sought to look beyond that and look at a broader range of socio-technical imaginaries involved in the net zero transition. And in doing so, they raise an important question of who sets the terms of these transitions, whose visions become the ones that get normalised and whose get left out. So some other researchers, Longhurst and Chilvers, mapped several different imaginaries of the energy transition in the UK across government, science and civil society. And they found that these different groups agree on several things. They agree in the need for a transition and that interventions are needed to manage it. They also agree that climate change is the motivation for the energy transition and that renewable energy must play a part in the transition and that carbon needs to be managed. But they also found some key differences in terms of how these changes should be made and who should have decision-making power. And these indicate that different socio-technical imaginaries with differences in their underlying models of social progress, the amount of attention paid to the distribution of costs and benefits, and a belief in more or less centralized models of governance happening across all these different imaginaries across different groups. So we already get a sense of sort of the complexity of these imaginaries. Another point that they raise is how people or the public are imagined in these different socio-technical imaginaries. So Jasanoff and Kim argue that our visions of the future are part of the means by which certain futures and not others come into being. I.e., if you can't imagine something, it's very difficult for it to become a reality. But socio-technical imaginaries indicate underlying assumptions about what society is and does, but also about people as individuals, or even, you could say, human nature. So if the public are conceived of as passive consumers or as active publics or some of these other categories on the slides, this will lead to different kinds of technologies and systems. So in a study with heat network professionals in Denmark, the researchers there discussed how the ways in which people as users of technologies are imagined by technical experts and systems designers has important implications for how technical systems are built. So in the case of fourth generation heat networks and smart energy systems, this might be particularly important given that they rely on a certain level of participation from users. So how users are conceptualized by those implementing such, in this case, flexible energy systems, therefore really has consequences. And I'm sure we all know that in reality, no one is entirely rational or entirely lazy or disinterested. People are complex, and so too are the contexts in which they operate. So to summarize, the point about socio-technical imaginaries is that they shape what's seen as thinkable and as what's possible. But they rely on assumptions about people that don't always necessarily bear out reality and which inadvertently close down other, potentially sometimes better ways of doing things, or at least ways in which there might be more public support. And as I'll discuss a little bit later, one remedy to this is public engagement, which takes time to find out what people think and understand about technologies, and which really establishes dialogue between developers, regulators, and members of the public. But first, I'm going to start getting into the three key areas that I want to focus on for the rest of my speech: change, place, and public engagement. And as mentioned, I'm going to spend most time on the first of these, change, and look at it from a couple of different angles, while also building on some of what I've just said about socio-technical imaginaries. So net zero is, as really obvious in one sense, a change. People who, like us, work on and with net zero in our professional lives refer to it routinely as a transition. That's what it is. But it can be easy to forget for those of us who know a bit about it and who are maybe sort of intrinsically excited or intrigued by change or this specific change, to overlook the fact that change can also arouse complex and ambivalent feelings, not least when it feels like it's coming out of nowhere or it feels inchoate. Social science research can help dig into what this change means for people as the transition is developed and implemented, and to help planners, regulators, policymakers, and so on try and anticipate how the transition will unfold. But even if you're not a social scientist, I would urge you to remind yourself every now and again that net zero is a fundamental and whole-scale change. Even as we might also try and minimize the disruption, and even as the evidence shows that it will still be a cheaper change with many more positive outcomes than just letting the planet continue to warm instead. Survey evidence shows that the majority of the public are concerned about climate change and do want emissions to be reduced and do want governments and industries to take action. But that doesn't mean that they're not also apprehensive about what that change will mean, how it will feel, whether they and policymakers and others will make some bad decisions as well as good ones along the way. One of the challenges in the net zero transition and switching to new and alternative technologies is the disruption it can cause. So in one study of home heating in the UK, Thomas and colleagues make the point that while disruption is often thought about in terms of the mess, noise, costs and inconvenience of someone digging up the road outside your house to install a heat network, or having to get new radiators to be compatible with a heat pump, or installing a charging point for your new electric car, these disruptions actually go a bit deeper than that. And they describe how they can be culturally and psychologically disruptive as well as materially disruptive. And this is because they intervene in the most personal, private, intimate, and therefore valued spaces in people's lives, their homes, their family lives, the places they live and work, and all the emotions and hopes and fears that those key cultural values represent. Some researchers have pointed out, for example, that heat networks might be less appealing in the UK because we have a less collective society than, say, Denmark, where district heating is prevalent. And this isn't as simple as an Englishman's home is his castle, though that is some of it, I'm sure. It's also about recognising that being an early adopter or trusting a company or government to implement a technology that does something as fundamental as heating and powering your home, which of course is for many of us our office these days as well, is a big leap of faith, not only because it might not work as you hope it will, but because you're risking going against a social norm. In the UK, 85% of homes are powered by a gas boiler. So getting a heat pump, which is the policy, is really going against the grain, and it entails material and financial disruption, but it also isn't the normal or usual thing to do. But this powerful effect of norms can be harnessed. For example, the London-based behavioural insights team write in their report, How to Build a Net Zero Society, that behavioural techniques can be employed to make green choices easier, more attractive, more socially normative, and more timely. And one way of doing this is to make these choices more visible, which can demystify them as well as making them seem more salient and familiar. And this not only starts to shift people's vision of the present and future, but can provide a more positive, hopeful narrative about change. And one example of this is an initiative of the Behavioural Insights team and Nesta called the Visit a Heat Pump scheme. And importantly, this is a way of using different levels of society to affect change in a positive way. So the scheme is funded by Nesta, which is itself funded by a government endowment, and it provides a platform for owners of heat pumps or the public and installers of heat pumps to connect with other members of the public who are interested in having a heat pump installed. So it's sort of essentially a peer-to-peer approach to behavioural change that's being supported financially and in terms of the original concept by Nesta, which aims to make installing a heat pump less daunting and more normal. And it's all part of their mission to support and foster innovation towards a sustainable future. So it's a really interesting example. So bringing together what I've said about socio-technical imaginaries, collective visions of the future, and technology's place in them, and about the emotions and values bound up in change and disruption, we can see that the net zero transition is a pinch point for hopes and fears of the future, and the often unnerving experience of large-scale rapid change. One reason why it might be unnerving, of course, is that this can feel like someone else's vision of the future, which is being imposed from above. For those who are implementing socio-technical imaginaries, it's important to remember the value of being transparent and honest about what your vision of the future is. Why this technology and not another? What changes will it make in the short and the long term? Will it disrupt everyday life, and how? And so on. As I've already said, survey after survey shows that the majority of people in the UK and around the world want action to mitigate climate change, but they don't always know or recognise that this is the case, that wanting to do something about climate change is in fact normal in the statistical and sociological sense. And raising awareness of this simple fact is one powerful way in which we can smooth the transition to net zero. Of course, the transition itself will have its ups and downs, like any other process of change, but having a shared vision of where we want to get to makes it much more likely to become a reality. So Access is a network of environmental social scientists across academia and policy-focused partner institutions, which includes the Environment Agency. And last year, they published a report that set out the case for building social scientific knowledge and tools into planning for net zero. And alongside the report, they included a number of case studies of past transitions, which we can learn from in the net zero transition. As the report points out, societal change and public support for policy issues is often catalysed by what they call galvanising issues. So, for example, in the UK, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the message about complying with measures like self-isolating and wearing masks as a way to protect the National Health Service seems to have struck a chord in a nation that's extremely proud of its health service and which also happens to be the biggest employer in the country. Galvanising issues tend to disrupt habits to establish a new norm, though interestingly, they tend to rely on appealing to other norms in order to be effective. So with COVID, it was protecting the NHS, and saving lives was a sort of happy byproduct of that. Similarly, the report talks about the ban on smoking in public spaces, which gained popular support in the UK due to raised awareness about the harms of passive smoking, especially to children. So focusing on passive smoking helps shift the argument away from one of personal freedoms or the individual's right to choose whether to smoke or not, to a new awareness that smoking's harms don't only affect the smoker. And we all know that mitigating and adapting to climate change can bring many co-benefits. So many campaigners and climate change communicators are recognising that sometimes it helps to start by approaching a campaign through a galvanising issue that might seem secondary, but has the advantage of being something around which people can coalesce. So this might be, for example, designing incentives for people to install solar panels in order to save on their electricity bills, which might then make switching to an electric car or installing a heat pump less daunting and running them less expensive, all of which will also obviously have a positive impact on their personal carbon footprint, even if that's not the sort of initial motivation. And this kind of approach is also helpful not only in appealing to the minority who aren't concerned about climate change, but also in flipping the narrative around change and disruption from one of negativity towards a positive vision of the future which results from that change. So to return to my initial list of how people and behaviour figure in the net zero transition, you'll notice that these first 3 points largely relate to efforts to encourage members of the public to take a role in the transition by doing things differently and making changes in their own lives. But of course, there's another aspect to the transition, which I've sort of been hovering around by talking about people's hopes and fears, and the concept of disruption. And that's the impacts that decarbonisation will have on people and society more broadly. So as I've said, the net zero transition is a fundamental, wide-ranging set of changes that will cause disruption, though that will tend to be temporary. And if it goes according to plan, should bring benefits overall. And so it will have impacts, both positive and negative, across all of these sectors, because they're all places where change will happen. And all those parts of life will see changes. As I've also said, one of the things that makes these changes challenging is that they seem to go against social and cultural norms. So we're at a point in history where we're on the brink of many of these changes, relying on early adopters, financial incentives, and public information campaigns to get technologies off the ground and to kickstart societal shifts such as the adoption of low meat diets. But as these shifts become normal, which is of course when they're no longer changes, we will start to look back and realise that they have also changed people and therefore society. Of course, the hope is that these will be largely positive changes, that the disruptions we face now will translate into better ways of living, and that a greener future will also be one that's more just, healthier, more socially cohesive, and so on. But once again, that depends on a shared vision of what a good future looks like. So having spoken in quite general terms about the changes entailed in the net zero transition and some of the ways in which publics perceive and respond to them, I'm going to turn now towards something a little bit more specific, which is the role of place and public perceptions of net zero technologies. And place is extremely important because research shows that general acceptance of new technologies and installations doesn't always translate into local acceptance, and I'm sure many of you can relate to that. So geographers define place as space which is meaningful. And that might be to individuals, communities, or society more broadly. So for me personally, the area of East London in which I live is a place because it's where I've lived for 10 years, where I often work, where my daughter goes to school and son goes to nursery, where several friends live, and where our allotment is. This area of London is essentially my backyard. Patrick Devine-Wright, one of the leading academics in this space, proposed a while ago that we rethink what and who NIMBYs are, and I'm sure you're probably familiar with this term, not in my backyard. Like other social scientists, he criticises the knee-jerk move to dismiss those who object to new developments, such as onshore wind farms, as NIMBYs, as unhelpful and divisive. He writes, place attachment is a positive emotional connection with familiar locations such as the home or neighbourhood. And this feeling of connection can prompt action to protect that place at individual and collective levels. He defines place identity as the ways in which physical and symbolic attributes of certain locations contribute to an individual's sense of self or identity. So this could be making a statement like, Venice is a part of me, or I am Venetian, something like that. Place disruption refers to events and changes that provoke emotional responses like anxiety and loss or a sense of displacement. And this could be anything from a flood to a burglary to the demolition of old buildings in a neighbourhood to conflict between neighbours. And these experiences may be sudden or incremental, and they can affect social networks as well as physical conditions. In the media, at least in the UK, but I'm sure elsewhere too, the term NIMBY is often used pejoratively, though it's used by people on various ends of the political spectrum, so it's not politicised in that sense. And it's a shorthand for dismissing the point of view of people whom the accuser has taken to be ignorant, irrational, selfish. Some assume that NIMBYism can be countered with more or better information that's rarely borne out in reality, as in fact many such protesters are highly informed. They simply take a different view from those accusing them of being NIMBYs. So you could instead see this opposition as a form of contestation about which types of information are most important and salient to a particular case. So Patrick Devine-Wright proposes that opposition to local developments should be understood instead as attempts to prevent forms of change interpreted as disrupting place attachment and threatening place identity. So as he says, whether a change is perceived as positive or negative depends on the form and intensity of attachment to place and how the change itself is interpreted. The type of attachment to place, i.e. whether it's primarily physical or social, will also shape how people interpret changes. And then responses to that change are in turn shaped by interpretations of both the process of decision-making and the outcomes of development. i.e. if people feel that a change is unnecessary, ineffective, or has been implemented unfairly, or without due consideration of the context, they're likely to view it negatively. Projects that are perceived to threaten or jar with the character of a place may be seen as a threat, while those that are seen as in keeping with a place may be more likely to be accepted. And that's one reason why, for example, there tends to be greater support in the UK again for carbon capture projects in some industrial clusters where heavy industry may be viewed as part of the identity of the place and the people who live there, and such technologies may be viewed as a way to clean up those existing industries whilst also promoting continuing or even new employment opportunities. So that is a bit of a generalisation. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about public engagement. I'm aware that many of you in this audience will have experience of public engagement work around CCS and other technologies, and I'm really be fascinated to hear your experiences and encourage you to share those when we come to the discussion. I personally have years of experience conducting social science research, but I don't have personal experience of doing this kind of public engagement work. So I'm going to be talking more about the evidence from social science literature, which is fairly substantial. So in a recent study of public attitudes to shale gas extraction, which is sort of the culmination of quite a lot of work in that field, Lorraine Whitmarsh and colleagues discuss imagined lay publics in the fracking debate, which, as you'll know, was quite a contentious one in the UK. And they make some important points about how the public is not homogenous, but can have different views and different perspectives and experiences that help shape those views. Further, they point out that those views are not static. They can shift with more information and with more experience. They also point out that framing publics as either for or against particular technology is overly simplistic. Many people are ambivalent or mildly accepting of technologies, and CCUS is one example of this. Shale gas is also interesting as while many energy technologies are evaluated by members of the public according to values like efficiency, affordability, and security, there's also a political dimension to how shale gas is perceived, which you also see with how people think about some other net zero technologies, I should say. So one of the most common perceptions that I hear from experts in this field is some version of the public need more facts. While there are elements of truth to this assumption, it also belies a rather simplistic understanding of both publics and of science. It suggests an assumption that the public are irrational, but also that scientists are completely rational. This is where I'm going to get provocative. So some of you may be familiar with the phrase knowledge deficit model, sometimes called information deficit model. It describes an approach to public engagement in which the public are diagnosed with a lack of knowledge or correct knowledge about a topic, and the cure is assumed to be giving them more information, and therefore knowledge, through a one-way flow of information from experts to the public. And social scientists have long criticised this model for being overly simplistic, for misunderstanding the ways in which people learn and form opinions, and for neglecting to think critically about how knowledge flows and how expertise is conferred. So one area in which this has been observed is climate change communication, where a belief that people simply need to know more information about climate change in order to change their behaviour has been repeatedly shown to be missing the mark. I'm sure you can all agree with that. The knowledge deficit model assumes that scientific or expert knowledge is superior to any other form of knowledge, and most audiences are intelligent enough to infer from this that the implication is that the knowledge and information they have is therefore inferior. The one-way flow of information also disadvantages scientists and experts, as it leaves them unable to understand the processes by which members of the public form judgments and make decisions, as well as the context in which those decisions are being made. And this can lead to a breakdown in trust, based in a mutual sense of not being understood and of not having one's viewpoint valued. One study of mental models in communication of risk associated with subsurface hydrology asked experts, geologists, and non-experts to explore their spatial knowledge of a local area. And they found that while geologists use 3D spatial reasoning, non-experts tended to use 2D reasoning and to focus on anthropomorphic aspects of the place and on the relationship between the surface and the subsurface. And they argue that making the effort to understand such mental models is valuable in helping scientists, regulators, policymakers, and operators to understand the context in which people come to accept or reject technologies. And this example is an important reminder that, in a sense, it doesn't only matter that much whether the knowledge people draw upon to make judgments is correct. It's the role that that knowledge has in making decisions that matters. So this isn't to say that we can't challenge people's ideas or show them new information or evidence. I'm not suggesting we insult people's intelligence by doing that. But we need to understand not just what people know, but what kinds of knowledge are salient to them and how and why. And who knows? Maybe the experts might even find that the public knows some things that they don't. So information and knowledge are important because they can help us understand and accept change, but there is more than one kind of knowledge. There's, of course, lots and lots to be said about public engagement, and I know we're going to be hearing a lot more about it today. But I did want to make sure that I spoke about fairness and justice before I proceed to some concluding thoughts. So, as you may know, distributive justice refers to whether resources and opportunities have been fairly distributed across a society or community, while procedural justice refers to the processes and procedures associated with the allocation of resources. So, for example, procedural justice has occurred when environmental regulations are enforced fairly, transparently, and consistently and are not open to bias. And these concepts take us beyond knowledge deficit and NIMBYism to a fuller understanding of how people perceive and come to accept or reject technologies. So it's not only about what people know about technologies, as in how they work, what they look like, how big they are, what they smell like, so on, but these questions here. What do these technologies mean for me and the place in which I live? If there are risks associated with them, are they balanced out by benefits? Will they be sufficiently and effectively regulated? Will different needs and interests be taken into account in where they're sited and how they're installed? Will they create jobs? And will those jobs be accessible to local people? Will they be decent jobs? Why has this technology been proposed for this need and not another? What will it all cost and who will pay? If people feel that technologies which they don't much like have still been developed and installed with due distributive and procedural justice, they may even nonetheless accept them because they respect and trust the decision-making process that's led there. So, as one study of public perceptions of CCS in the Netherlands and the UK showed, for example, this will only happen if people feel they've been given a genuine opportunity to have their voice heard and considered. If they feel they've been given an opportunity to give their view, but then that's been disregarded, this can be bad as not engaging at all. So it really needs to be sort of meaningful engagement. So, as mentioned, my brief today was to talk about net zero technologies generally. But before I sort of start to wrap up, I do want to mention some social scientific research on carbon capture, which, as you probably know, is actually quite a big area of research within social sciences. So, this public dialogue was commissioned by the UK government and conducted by ScienceWise and other partners. And it exemplifies this research in many ways, both in terms of its methods and its findings. So the researchers conducted deliberative research with members of the public in 5 locations across the UK. 4 that are locations where CCUS is likely to be deployed and 1 where it's not, so they could kind of compare. And their key findings were that public support for CCUS is conditional on it being effective, and that's specifically effective at reducing CO2 emissions, not just whether it works, on a day-to-day level, and safe. And there was still a minority who saw CCUS as tackling the symptom rather than the cause of climate change and as delaying the switch to renewables. And those people did not change their position during the deliberative process. In fact, it hardened, which is a really important lesson, I think. Some common expectations amongst people in this study were that people want effective governance, independent of government and industry, to ensure, again, that CCUS is safe for people and the environment. They also want inclusive and meaningful public engagement, including transparent information about risks and benefits and costs from trusted messengers, and they want to have their views listened to. People expect job creation for local people, but are wary about how this works out in practice because many of these locations where this research was done were sort of post-industrial locations. And this points to the importance, again, of place in this research. So the participants prioritise CCUS's contribution to reaching net zero when thinking about whether they'd accept its deployment in the UK in general, but when it came to whether they'd accept it locally, they were much more likely to focus on more concrete considerations about what it would mean for the place and the people who live there. So as I've mentioned, all of the participants wanted CCUS to provide jobs for locals. In Aberdeen, for example, this reflected a specific hope that these jobs would replace those in the oil and gas industry, i.e. that there would be a smooth and just transition for workers with minimal negative local economic impacts. While in Teesside, there was a sense that CCUS would revive the area following industrial decline. But then in Liverpool, there was greater cynicism about past experiences with industries like this, in which people perceived a pattern in which industries come in and make use of Liverpool, but there aren't many benefits for local people. So you can see that there are sort of nuances between different places. So I said earlier that net zero is a socio-technical challenge. It's one of both society and technology, and we therefore need people working together on this challenge from all disciplines. And to work together, we need to understand where each other are coming from and how we might be able to get to some form of shared vision of a positive future. As I've discussed, socio-technical imaginaries are not only ideas that exist in the abstract, but they have material effects. They help determine what's thinkable and what's possible and what isn't. They open up new horizons, and because even horizons have their limits, they close others down. Net zero is, yes, I'm going to say it again, but probably the last time, a fundamental change. It's not only a transition that will be enabled by technologies, governance, regulation, and policy levers, as if that wasn't enough to be getting on with. It's also a disruption to people's everyday lives that touches the most personal, intimate, and highly valued spaces and relationships. The home, family, work, where they walk the dog. Net zero is a repository of our hopes and fears for the future. And it's worth remembering that it's not only members of the public who have hopes and fears for the future, we all do. And we all draw on different types of knowledge and experience to visualize those futures in our own minds. The role and value of social science evidence and analysis for policy and regulation of net zero is therefore a simple yet complex one. To help understand how and why people think and act the way they do, to play our own part in smoothing the path to a just low carbon future. So I'll finish in true social scientist style with a question rather than an answer. What is your imaginary of the net zero future? Thank you very much for listening.